Great to see so many of you here, and welcome to this inaugural lecture for our HCRI's honorary lecturer, John Borton. John actually began his lectureship last year, in fact, so we're a little late holding tonight's event, but all the more pleased to have it as a result, and great that means that you'll be able to join us. It's an immense privilege for me to be part of this evening's event and to mark not only an important and inadequately understood part of the history of the humanitarian sector, that's the story of Merlin that John will be talking about, so not only to mark that story, but also John's career and his current collaboration with us here at Manchester. In addition to his honorary lectureship and his freelance work, John is a senior research associate with the Overseas Development Institute. He is joined for this evening's discussion by Paula Sanson, who's down the front here, and is the Deputy Health Director of Programs with Goal UK, and by Jenny Chapman, down the front on the other side, whose research is on the history of British humanitarianism. And thank you both for being part of this event too. Now, Merlin was founded in 1993, and that year also saw the release by Nokia of the first mass-produced mobile phone. But we're not here to talk about the proliferation of mobile phones, so if you could put them all on silence if you haven't already, we'll focus on the humanitarian part of this history. Following John's lecture, we'll have comments from Paula and Jenny, and then we'll open up to questions from the crowd. So I'll introduce each of our other speakers in a little more detail before they come up front, and we have a drinks reception following this event, which we are all warmly invited and hope you can join us. So John has worked within the international humanitarian sector since 1981 in a variety of operational, evaluation, research and capacity development roles. In 1991, he joined the Overseas Development Institute, where he undertook research on a range of issues to do with humanitarian response, where he played a lead role in establishing what is now known as the Humanitarian Practice Network, as well as the Active Learning Network for Accountability and Performance in Humanitarian Action, which you may know as ALNAP. Both of these are still housed at ODI and play an important role in promoting proficient and self-reflexive aid. From 1994 to 96, John led Study 3 of the Joint Evaluation of Emergency Assistance to Rwanda. The joint evaluation on Rwanda was initiated only a few months after the end of the genocide and the arrival of nearly 2 million refugees into Zaire. Of the 5 studies that made up the joint evaluation, John led the largest, Study number 3 on humanitarian aid. While the team found that good work had been done by humanitarian agencies, it also criticised the highly variable standards of care. And their recommendations fed into accountability initiatives like ALNAP and SPHERE, but the evaluation process also offered a kind of outlet for agencies and individuals still working through the terrible experiences of the genocide and its aftermath. John left ODI in 2002 to adopt a freelance role. One of his important activities since then has been supporting the governance and staff of a large NGO program in Darfur, a role that he undertook over a 10-year period. He also works with the Emergency Nutrition Network and regularly contributes research and advice on issues around accountability in particular. His work at the moment focuses on the volunteer response to the movement of refugees and vulnerable migrants across Europe. And if you wish to know more about this research, the most recent edition of Humanitarian Exchange magazine, which is available online and open access, features an article by John indicating some of these initiatives, what spurred individuals to act, and what we still need to know about their attempts to support people in makeshift camps and on the move. Could some of these groups of spontaneous volunteers become a new Merlin, a new MSF or Save the Children? We will have to wait and see. John's commitment to improving humanitarian practice underpins the interest he has developed in making the history of humanitarian action more accessible and better understood. It was this interest in humanitarian history that resulted in my meeting John several years ago now as part of a project at the ODI's Humanitarian Policy Group. I was fresh from a history PhD, but very poorly informed about the dynamics of the aid sector. In a sense, I knew about the past, but not about how that past connected to the present. John's insights and patience made him an exceptionally valuable mentor. Since then, I have enjoyed and benefited enormously from our conversations about why organisations act the way they do, how we learn, and the contribution that research can make. By now, however, you must be keen to hear more from John and less from me, so please join me in welcoming him for his inaugural lecture.
Thank you very much, Eleanor. That removes the need for my first paragraph.
Please do it anyway.
About my history. Thank you. That was a pretty comprehensive statement of my career. But anyhow, here we go. Ladies and gentlemen, honoured guests, it's an honour to be here at the University of Manchester for my inaugural lecture. As you heard, all my career I've been working in the humanitarian sector. I won't rehash that part of it. But in all that time, it's as though I've been on the edge of academia, giving occasional lectures at different universities, helping students who approach me with research advice, being interviewed by them on particular aspects of Rwanda or accountability. And sometimes I've even gone down into my garage and dug out stuff from my archive in the garage. But so I've been on the edge of academia, but never really within it. So it's flattering to have been appointed as an honorary lecturer here at Humanitarian and Conflict Response Institute. And I'd like to thank Bertrand Taith for proposing my appointment and encouraging me into the Institute. I've visited HCRI a few times, and now I know some colleagues quite well. I look forward to continuing my work with them and getting to know and learn from what is an impressive faculty. As Eleanor was saying, over the last 4 or 5 years, I've become particularly interested in humanitarian history and making that history more accessible to humanitarian workers. Often they're not as aware of, as they should be of the history that has gone before. And as Eleanor said, together we've developed the idea of humanitarian history, which is which is a portal for improving access, making it easier for them to access that history. And I really hope that now that I'm fully within HCRI that we can progress that. It's a joint project between HCRI and ODI. I was remembering a comment you made, Eleanor. She was asked once how we would measure the success of humanitarian history, this website that we hope to create, how we would measure its impact. And she said that the word unprecedented would be used less in the sector. Because the word unprecedented is very much overused, and for very, very often there are many precedents for what is being claimed to be unprecedented. So my lecture this evening is about Merlin. That's short for the Medical Emergency Relief International. So Merlin was a UK-based humanitarian agency specialising in the provision of frontline healthcare in areas of conflict and natural disasters, and in strengthening national health systems in fragile states. So established as a charity in 1993, Merlin grew to become a medium-sized charity. Not one of the largest, but medium, but it certainly wasn't small. Its overall income peaked at £69 million in 2011. Merlin's achievements were many. It operated programs in some 40 countries. It played an important role in the developing responses to diseases such as tuberculosis, TB, Lassa fever, and malaria. It made a significant contribution to the evolution of the UN's cluster system for coordination during emergencies. And it made a significant contribution to international policy on healthcare provision and health system strengthening in fragile states. In 2013, Merlin was saved from financial collapse by Save the Children. The cost of transitioning Merlin into Save the Children was supported by the Department for International Development and by one of Save the Children's corporate supporters. The total cost of the transition was about £4 million. Under the arrangement, Merlin merged with Save, though officially they preferred the phrase joined forces. And by early 2015, all but one of Merlin's programmes had been transitioned, to use the term that was used, transitioned into Save the Children. The one exception was Merlin's Pakistan programme, which was a more complicated process, but that programme was closed in March of this year. So Merlin exists still on paper, it's still registered with the Charity Commission, but it has no charitable activities, so effectively it's ceased to function. So in the summer of 2014, thanks largely to the wisdom of the transition CEO of Merlin, David Alexander, it was agreed to commission the preparation of a history of Merlin so that its 20-year history could be captured for posterity and learning derived from its experience. So I was contracted as the principal investigator of the Merlin History Project, and I recruited Luke Kelly as my research assistant. Now Luke is a postdoc historian here at Manchester, and I was hoping that he was in the audience, but maybe he'll join us for the drinks afterwards. But yes, he was a great research assistant. I wanted to thank him publicly for his contribution to this work. For Merlin's earlier years, we made use of the physical archive held in the historic dockyard buildings at Chatham. And for the period from 2005 onwards, we used the digital archive. Neither of these archives were well maintained or very navigable. Consequently, interviews with key former staff and trustees and others, such as donor officials and agencies that used to work alongside Merlin, proved vital sources of information. Unfortunately for us, some of these people that we interviewed had maintained their own private collections of papers, and these proved invaluable. I remember one very significant contribution was made by someone who kept a box with about 20 kilos of paper in their barn in Devon, and it was indispensable. It covered a whole period of Merlin's history that otherwise we wouldn't have had insight into what the board of Merlin had been thinking, because those papers didn't exist in the archive. So in March this year, coinciding rather neatly with the closure of the Pakistan programme, our revised and shortened, because the first draft was so long, our revised and shortened report was approved. Together with colleagues from Save the Children, we're hoping to publish the report and put it in the public domain in due course. Hopefully commercial publication. So, what was Merlin? How did it develop? Why did it run into financial difficulties? And what does this tell us about the changes within the international humanitarian sector? The stories of how NGOs came into being are often assume mythological status, helping to set the identity of the organisation. Merlin's founding story is no different. At the end of 1989, two British friends, Christopher Bess, a physician, and Nicholas Mellor, a management consultant, drove a transit van loaded with donated medicines to Bucharest at the height of the Romanian Revolution, in an action very similar to the sorts of actions that grassroots organisations have been doing in response to the European refugee crisis. As a result of their experience, they formed the view that the UK lacked a fast, flexible, professional emergency medical response agency similar to Médecins Sans Frontières. Over the next 3 years, they explored and developed the idea of forming a British MSF. In 1991, during the height of the Kurdish crisis at the end of the First Gulf War, Nicholas Mellor met Mark Dalton, a British logistician working for MSF on the Iran-Iraq border, and Mark joined the other two in developing the idea of a British MSF. In the summer of 1992, they took the idea to the head of MSF International in Brussels. But by that point, MSF had already formed 5 operational centres, and a moratorium had been set on the creation of new operational centres. So if an MSF UK was to be formed, it could only be a support section, providing funds and personnel to the operational centres, which in the UK's case is MSF in Holland, so Operational Centre Amsterdam. The idea of forming an MSF UK that was not directly involved in operational response was definitely not what the three had in mind. So they pressed ahead with the idea of developing a British organisation that was separate from MSF. In late 1992, the siege of Sarajevo was underway, and the threat of starvation in this city of 400,000 people was very real. The three friends were approached by the Soros Foundation to supply 370 tons of food rations to Sarajevo, so long as they established first this new organisation that Soros had heard was in the process of being formed. So that gave them the incentive to really push and register Merlin as a charity. So they worked around the clock over Christmas and the New Year and registered Merlin as a charity on the 11th of January 1993. They researched food rations, procured British Army meals ready to eat that had been stored in Germany, and then transported these to Zagreb, where they were loaded onto the UN air bridge, and one of the few. There's a photo from an early time of the rations being loaded onto the flight for airlifting into Sarajevo. With Christopher Bess as its first CEO, Merlin followed its Sarajevo mission with short medical programs in Nagorno-Karabakh, Azerbaijan and Georgia, each of those operations being the result of the breakup of the USSR that was then underway. The following year, in response to a dramatic increase in the incidence of tuberculosis in Russia, Merlin began an anti-TB program in Siberia, supporting the Tomsk Oblast TB services. Over the following years, Merlin played a key role in working with the Tomsk authorities to demonstrate the effectiveness of the WHO DOTS program, directly observable treatment short course therapy. It's still in there. The treatment protocol was then rolled out across the whole of Russia, from Tomsk and then Ivanovo, which was the WHO flagship site. So Merlin, in supporting the Tomsk authorities, made a very significant contribution to reducing the incidence of TB in Russia. 1994, so that same year that they began in Tomsk, also saw the genocide in Rwanda and the massive population displacement. Merlin deployed medical teams to southwest Rwanda and to Goma in eastern Zaire. The team in Goma was asked to coordinate medical care at the Ndosho orphanage that, in the space of 1 week, had seen the number of children in its care rise from 40 to 2,500. Inevitably, because there was dysentery and cholera in the camps around them, there was a dysentery outbreak in the orphanage. The Merlin team introduced a system whereby older children were asked to supervise and assist groups of younger children, just as a way of managing such large numbers. A singing and dancing competition between the groups was held to encourage the adoption of key health messages and cleanliness messages. This and the use of antibiotic treatments successfully reduced the number of dysentery cases from 155 per week to 27 over the course of just 2 weeks. As a result of its work in the orphanage, Merlin was awarded an international prize. So by the end of 1994, Merlin had developed a reputation as a professional, creative and courageous medical agency, working in difficult and challenging contexts around the world. I don't have time to go through all of Merlin's programmes. I've only 30 minutes, but what I'm going to do is show you a slide that gives you a sense of the number and sequencing of Merlin's programmes. So just to explain this, so there's Merlin's 20 years along the top, and each bar represents a programme. And as you can see, the start date of the programmes moves down until the last programme, which was Syria. It was begun in 2013. So as you can see, there's some very short interventions, programmes at the beginning, and then the Siberia programme, the Zaire programme, these long ones that went on almost through the whole life of Merlin. The significance of the shading is the darker ones are one that we describe in detail in our report. The lighter ones are ones that we didn't have time or we didn't have the material to go in to describe the programmes in detail. I'll now focus on two of these programmes, partly to convey a sense of Merlin's work, but also to show how Merlin's programmes in these two countries developed and were funded. So the two countries I'm going to talk about are Zaire and Myanmar. So Zaire first. In 1996, Merlin teams were still working in Rwanda, just across the border from the huge refugee camps that were still there in Goma. These camps were a source of significant insecurity in northwest Rwanda, and the post-genocide government in Rwanda wanted the camps closed. In late 1996, the AFDL rebel movement, led by Laurent Kabila, was formed in eastern Zaire with support from the Rwandan government and army. In November 1996, the AFDL/Rwandan force attacked the camps in Goma, driving over 500,000 refugees back into Rwanda over the course of just 1 week. As part of its response, Merlin placed a medical team running a dispensary right at the border, on the road, the crossing point from Goma. And you can imagine, and I'm sure you've seen the pictures of just stream and stream and stream of people walking back into Rwanda, fleeing the attacks on the camps that were behind them. So Merlin's established a dispensary at the border crossing and provided in excess of 1,000 consultations a week. It kept account of the numbers of refugees flowing through the border crossing point. As the flow began to ebb after the first 10 days or so, Merlin sent a team into Goma to see what was left, what the situation was in Goma. And there they found many bodies. They organised locally recruited teams of volunteers to bury the bodies. Very few agencies had a presence in Goma at the time because they were all in Rwanda, focusing on the needs of the 500,000 who had crossed into Rwanda. Because of their counting of the refugees who had moved back into Rwanda and what was known about the numbers who had been in the camps before the attacks, the Merlin team was convinced that between 200 to 300,000 refugees had moved eastwards. Moved westwards, further into Zaire, not eastwards into Rwanda. And that the ones who had moved westwards, deeper into Zaire, were being pursued by the AFDL and the Rwandan army. This was completely counter to the narrative that all refugees had returned to Rwanda, that was coming from the Rwandan government, supported, it has to be said, by the British and American governments. The Merlin team organised a low-level search by plane of potential routes west and south of Goma, and located and filmed large numbers of Rwandan refugees moving westwards. That film was broadcast by the BBC and forced a change in the dominant narrative. The refugees who had fled deeper into Zaire took two routes. A northern route running across to Kisangani and a southwestern route towards Kindu. Many of those on the northern route had been located at Tingi Tingi, and the UN and other agencies were focusing on assistance here. Fairly typically, the Merlin team chose not to work in Tingi Tingi, but to focus on the southwestern route, and used small planes to land at airstrips where they carried out assessments. And you can imagine the airstrips in Zaire, eastern Zaire, thick tropical forest. As a result of these assessments, Merlin began supporting rundown health facilities that had been overwhelmed by the arrival of the refugees in areas around Lulingu, Kachungu in South Kivu province. Aware that the location of the programs could lead to the whereabouts of the refugees becoming known by the militias and the killing squads who were searching for them, Merlin also began supporting the hospital in Kindu, in the capital of Maniema province, as a way of misleading the killing squads in thinking that the refugees were probably around Kindu. So that was their motive for starting a program that became a huge part of Merlin's work in Zaire. From this initial base in South Kivu and Maniema, Merlin's program in Zaire, which then of course was renamed Democratic Republic of Congo in 1997 following Laurent Kabila's assault and successful capture of Kinshasa. The program expanded to include the construction, rehabilitation and support to health facilities and hospitals not only in South Kivu and Maniema provinces, but also in Oriental province, Kasai Oriental and North Kivu, huge areas. This was achieved with funding from the European Commission, ECHO, the US government, the Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance, and the British government, DFID. In 2004, ECHO stopped funding humanitarian programs in Kasai Oriental on the grounds that the needs were chronic and not humanitarian. This was a classic case of humanitarian funding not linking to longer-term post-emergency funding mechanisms. The size of Merlin's program fell for a period, but from 2006 onward, it began increasing steadily as Merlin successfully won outright or participated in successful funding bids by consortia of agencies coming together to bid for large donor funding health sector contracts. From an expenditure level in 2003 of 2.3 million, by 2011 Merlin's annual expenditure had grown to 14.3 million. So for a fairly modest NGO to be handling programs of that size is a huge undertaking. Merlin, by 2011, Merlin was supporting no fewer than 243 health centres across 18 health zones, providing healthcare for nearly 2.2 million people. In 2010 alone, it rehabilitated 9 hospitals. So now I want to turn to the case of Myanmar, which of course comes later, but it also gives a sense from a later period in Merlin's history of how Merlin developed. So Merlin's program in Myanmar began shortly after the Indian Ocean tsunami of December 2004. Along with all other humanitarian NGOs, Merlin received huge sums of money to respond to the devastation on the countries around the Indian Ocean, principally Indonesia, Thailand, India and Sri Lanka, where in all 217,000 people were killed or registered as missing. 10 other countries were hit by the tsunami, including Myanmar, despite its distance from the epicenter. And in Myanmar, 61 people were killed and 2,000 people displaced. And this was all in the Irrawaddy Delta region, low-lying deltaic area. In early 2005, Merlin established a program in Laputa Township, an area of the Delta containing 500 difficult-to-reach villages, with a total population of around 350,000. The programme included restoring water supplies, improving health services and malaria prevention. Subsequently, it expanded to include rehabilitating health facilities and hospitals and a training programme for community health workers. But the size of the Myanmar programme remained pretty modest, around $500,000 a year. But then in May 2008, Cyclone Nargis struck this region of Myanmar, having a huge impact on the Irrawaddy Delta region, killing an estimated 138,000 people. Some of Merlin's own staff were killed during the cyclone, and it was estimated that 17% of the 540 community health workers that they had trained were also killed. Merlin's presence in Laputa proved to be crucial. Despite government restrictions on staff from international agencies accessing the affected area, 2 people from Merlin's emergency response team in London, including Paul Sanson, who I'm delighted is on the panel this evening, were able to reach Laputa and help staff organise their response, even though the government restrictions prevented them from travelling outside the town. Boat teams comprising a doctor, nurse and staff redeployed from the Merlin office in the capital moved around the affected area, providing healthcare, health promotion and conducting assessments. Subsequently, a large tourist river cruiser, the Pandau, was loaned to Merlin by a tourist company. The Pandau was used as a floating clinic positioned further out in the Delta. It was used to treat cases as a hub for transferring the most severe cases to hospital, and as an overnight base by the boat teams. In all, 20,000 patients were treated on the Pandau. Teams from Mercy Corps and Oxfam, without previous experience in Myanmar, partnered with Merlin, drawing on its local knowledge. 3 weeks after the cyclone, Merlin was requested by WHO to serve as the co-lead of the health cluster in Myanmar. Subsequently, Merlin was requested to co-chair the early recovery subgroup for the development of the health component of a comprehensive 3-year strategy to rebuild livelihoods, healthcare and education systems and improve food security. That strategy was PONREP, the Post-Nargis Recovery and Preparedness Plan. Merlin played a key role in PONREP, as well as implementing its own programme of rehabilitating health facilities and implementing a community-based healthcare activities. Merlin's expenditure in Myanmar in 2008 leapt from £500,000 a year to over £4 million a year. Though expenditures in the following years were below this level, as a result of its credibility with the authorities and new funding opportunities becoming available, Merlin was able to expand its programme to different parts of Myanmar. Invariably, these programmes combined health facility construction and rehabilitation with community-based healthcare activities. By 2013, Merlin was working in no fewer than 6 of Myanmar's 14 states. So, having provided a sense of Merlin's origins and two of its longer-running programmes, I now want to sort of pan out and look at how Merlin evolved as an organisation, and how, to a significant degree, this evolution was a process of adapting to the changing context and the funding environment for humanitarian agencies. When it was starting out, Merlin basically took funding from wherever it could get. But gradually a pattern evolved where it applied for grant funding, and I stress grant funding, for short-term interventions in specific locations. Usually these interventions were 3 or 6 months long, and the funding came from the then Overseas Development Administration, ECHO, and the Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance in America. In May 1997, the Labour Party won the UK general election, and Claire Short was appointed Secretary of State for the newly created Department for International Development, so DFID as we now know it. DFID replaced the former Overseas Development Administration. This was the first time that international development had been represented at cabinet level in the UK government. The following months saw a raft of changes in relation to the way funding was provided to UK humanitarian NGOs and in the UK government's approach to humanitarian action. New guidelines on humanitarian assistance were introduced in May 1997, specifying the procedures and formats for project proposals and the monitoring and reporting requirements for approved projects. One of the requirements was that all projects requesting over £100,000 needed a logical framework to explain its objectives and how the outcomes would be measured. And in March 1998, Claire Short and her ministers began articulating principles for what they termed a new humanitarianism that would be more principled, more developmental, and seek to address the underlying causes of both natural disasters and conflicts. The push for humanitarian aid to be more developmental received support from the UK community, though many felt uneasy with the call to address the underlying causes of conflict, as it implied a degree of instrumentalisation and an assumption that DFID's interpretation of the underlying causes would be shared by the humanitarian NGOs, whose declared principles, of course, were those of humanity, neutrality, impartiality and independence. Something that was more widely accepted amongst NGOs at this time was an emergency response programme was more likely to be effective if the NGO had a prior presence in the disaster-affected country. Something that we saw only too well in the later case, a decade later, in the case of Myanmar. In June 1997, Merlin became a member of the UK Disasters Emergency Committee, and it participated in DEC appeals for the Bahr el-Ghazal famine in Sudan and the Mozambique flood appeal in 2000. Evaluations of both these programmes were critical of Merlin's response, largely because of its lack of familiarity and connections within these countries, and the length of time it took Merlin to become effective in these new locations. So Merlin's model of being a quick response NGO, an idea that had been so influential when Merlin was conceived by the three friends back in 1992, was being directly challenged. And Merlin was forced to adapt and try to maintain a long-term presence in more countries. So the fundamental business model of the organisation changed at this time. In 1998, Christopher Bess, the founder, one of the three founders, left Merlin after 5 years as CEO. And as happens quite often with NGOs, the departure of the charismatic, energetic and visionary founder was then followed by a challenging period for the organisation, marked by high turnover in the CEO positions, policy disputes amongst staff, funding challenges, and a period of severe cuts and retrenchment of staff. In 1999, Merlin came perilously close to having to close as a result of a deficit that was not underwritten. It was in this period of financial challenge that Merlin found it difficult to establish new programs, although there was one program opened, and that was in Afghanistan, which was reopened after the ousting of the Taliban, if you remember, in 2001. So what caused this funding crisis? A major issue was that it was far too dependent on funding from donors such as DFID and ECHO, funding that was tied to specific programs, so-called restricted income. Despite valiant efforts by Merlin's supporters to raise funds through fundraising events, sponsored marathons, village fetes and so on, these rarely kept up with Merlin's restricted income, which was growing. Whilst Merlin was successful in accessing donor funding, it was much less effective at raising unrestricted funding. A widely accepted rule of thumb amongst NGOs is that if unrestricted income is less than 10% of total income, then the organisation is not able to operate efficiently. In 1998, unrestricted funding formed just 3.6% of Merlin's income. This situation affected Merlin in two ways. First, it had few options if it wanted to undertake programmes in areas that were not a priority for the institutional funders. Second, it made Merlin more vulnerable to changes in donor funding priorities and procedures. Arguably, the early leadership of Merlin allowed the organisation to grow too rapidly using institutional funding from donors and did not sufficiently prioritise the development of unrestricted fundraising. Though fundraising efforts improved significantly from 2005 onwards, greatly assisted by the dramatic expansion of the database of private donors as a result of the Indian Ocean tsunami, and Merlin's participation in a Christmas appeal run by the Daily Telegraph, where they were able to follow up the donations right to the donors. The Telegraph gave them the addresses of the donors, and then they asked the donors if they wanted to become supporters of Merlin, and that greatly increased the supporter base that Merlin had. So although the situation improved greatly after that 2005, Merlin never really escaped the problem of low levels of unrestricted funding, which over a 3-year period, 2009 to 2011, averaged 11.4% of total income. So just above the 10% level, but still significantly below the levels of unrestricted funding that most NGOs manage to maintain. 25, 60% unrestricted funding in some cases. So Merlin was always, its finances were always bumping along the bottom, close to the edge. The changes in donor funding procedures that were introduced in the late 1990s were followed by other changes. Allowable overhead recovery rates were driven down. Whilst these had averaged 7 to 12% in earlier years, by 2010 Merlin's finance team were projecting a recovery rate of just 6.2%. Furthermore, donor payment schedules tended to place the risk burden on NGOs, even though, as humanitarian NGOs, they were operating in volatile and extremely challenging environments. Increasingly, also, donors encouraged private sector companies to compete for funding alongside NGOs in the delivery of assistance, particularly in the healthcare sector. In an effort to reduce their own transaction and management costs, donors moved to large multi-year funding contracts. By 2010, it had become standard practice for DFID to award health-related contracts to consortia of NGOs headed by private sector consultancy and project management groups. Similarly, EU grants in the health sector were being awarded through a lot system, in which consortia had to pre-qualify in order to be able to bid for particular grants and funding streams, to accord with public procurement and EU competition rules. While such approaches could be beneficial for NGOs in the winning consortia, those in the losing consortia could experience the loss of major part of their work in a country, most likely resulting in substantial layoffs of experienced national and international staff. This is precisely what happened to Merlin and DRC in December 2011, when a large DFID contract came to an end and was not replaced. The ending of this contract contributed to the drop in Merlin's overall income in the following year. So this more competitive environment was one which favoured NGOs with effective and detailed financial management systems, able to generate accurate cost estimates for use in bids. It favoured NGOs able to attract and retain the most capable staff. And it favoured larger NGOs with substantial reserves, financial reserves, and therefore better able to cope with losing out on the occasional large contract. On each of these counts, Merlin was at a disadvantage. Neither the financial nor the human resource management systems had received the levels of investment necessary for Merlin to, as it were, compete with the big boys. Following criticism by its auditors for using a very basic financial management package during the Indian Ocean tsunami response in 2005, Merlin selected a new integrated finance package. But 5 years later, it had still not been rolled out across the whole organisation. And in 2010, the board was informed that there was no link between finance and logistics in this new system. Merlin also experienced high vacancy rates and high rates of staff turnover. In 2005, the overall vacancy rate across 158 international posts in the organisation was 27%. Even though this was improved in subsequent years, key posts often went unfilled for long periods. For instance, the lack of a country health director for almost 2 years in the Tajikistan programme contributed to it being slow to develop more sustainable approaches and to the decision in 2007 to close the programme completely. Other factors contributed to Merlin's worsening financial difficulties from around 2010 onwards. The loss of a DFID core grant that had been supporting key teams in the head office that had contributed, and these teams had contributed significantly to Merlin's raised profile from 2006 onwards. This was the Health Policy Unit, the Merlin Response Team, the MRT, and the Monitoring and Evaluation Unit. Investment in another thing that contributed to the difficulties was that it had been decided to try and launch Merlin USA as a way of tapping into developing the relationship with USAID and OFDA, the Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance, and also tapping into the perceived wealth of America and their generosity in giving to charities. But that investment didn't come close to yielding the benefits that had been anticipated. So Merlin had actually been subsidising Merlin USA right up until it was closed in 2013. As a result of such difficulties, the organisation's unrestricted reserves, in effect its financial cushion, fell from a peak of 8 million in 2009 to 5.5 million in 2011, bringing it close to the 4 million level that the trustees had agreed to be the minimum level for sustaining the organisation. Overall income for 2012 had been projected to rise to 65 million, but as a result of factors including the loss of the big DFID contract in DRC, came in at under 61 million. To cover costs, unrestricted reserves were drawn down, so the unrestricted reserves fell to 2.8 million, so below the 4 million level set by the trustees. To avoid Merlin becoming insolvent and having to be wound up, discussions took place in late 2012, first with Plan UK over a possible joint venture. By January 2013, it had become clear that Plan International's headquarters were not prepared to approve the joint venture, and the process was brought to a halt. Discussions were then started with Save the Children, and after a due diligence process, the public announcement that Merlin was to join forces with Save the Children UK was made public on 16th of July 2013. Merlin's CEO was replaced and a new transition board formed under a new chair. So in concluding, it's not possible in just one lecture to do justice to the full complexity of Merlin's story, the many achievements of the organisation and the contribution of its commitment of its staff. But hopefully this lecture has given a sense of Merlin's work and some of the factors contributing to the decision to join forces with Save the Children and for Merlin ceasing as a separate organisation. I hope I've conveyed a sense that at root, Merlin was unable to keep up with the changes in the way institutional funders provided funds to humanitarian NGOs. In an increasingly competitive funding environment, it fell victim to these changes and its inability to adapt to them. I would argue that this inability to adapt can be traced back to its conception and decisions taken by its leadership throughout its 20-year history. The fact that other humanitarian NGOs have managed to adapt and survive, and in some cases even thrive, in the face of such changes, suggests that Merlin could have survived had its cards been better played. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. I'm sure you all have many questions, but please write them down, keep them in your minds. We're going to hear from our discussants first. I might get you all to take a seat at the front here so people can see you, and John, you can stay in the spotlight. First up, we're going to hear from Paula Sansom. As I mentioned before, is currently the Deputy Health Director of Programs with Goal UK. Paula is a nurse with over 20 years' experience in the humanitarian sector and worked at Merlin for 14 years. Including 5 years leading, coordinating and responding to emergencies resulting from natural disasters and conflict. She later became Merlin's head of international programs and has also worked with Save the Children International in operations and particularly in their Ebola response. Paula was awarded an MBE in the 2016 New Year's Honours List for humanitarian services to emergency healthcare abroad.
So I'm going to touch a bit on some of the stuff that John said, probably less on the financial, more on the programmes. So I first worked with Merlin leading an assessment into Kabul at the end of 2001 after the airstrikes had finished, in a plan to re-enter Afghanistan after being chased out by the Taliban, apparently literally from the airport in Iraq. And there we were able to establish programs to rehabilitate and restock the central laboratory in Kabul, rehabilitate and re-equip some of the maternal and child health clinics, and also help the Ministry of Health to reactivate and computerise some of its health information management system. And after that I came back to the UK and worked on and off with Merlin in a variety of roles until I got transitioned to Save the Children in September 2014, and we went out with the Ebola response to Sierra Leone. And I just wanted to touch on and expand further on a few areas of Merlin's work, which I feel illustrates some of the points that John made. Over the time I was in Merlin, the majority of our programs were linked to support the health system, and primarily the Ministry of Health. We tried also to stay beyond the initial emergency phase. This actually became sometimes where MSF would come up and ask us if we'd take on some of their programming. At the time it was much more difficult because they were quite often working in a private health centre or a private home doing the clinic. So most of our programs we tried, at least after the initial phase, to support the services that were running. So that was around sort of health system strengthening, but probably much more on direct service delivery, and that would be around rehabilitating clinics or hospitals, providing equipment and supplies, training where staff were not being paid, giving them incentives, or where they were not working a full day, we would give them incentives to work longer. And also trying to improve supervision of health workers in clinics, so doing joint supervision with the Ministry of Health. And over time our emergency work often began to reflect this as well. So after the Pakistan earthquake in 2005, where we could, we tried to site our temporary health facilities close to the damaged or destroyed Ministry of Health facilities. And gradually as health workers returned, many of them were displaced into IDP camps in Muzaffarabad. We worked with the Ministry of Health and the local health authorities to incorporate those staff into our clinic teams. And during the emergency phase, to make sure we got coverage when to provide outreach, whether that was on foot or occasionally by helicopter, to get to the more hard to reach areas mostly that have been cut off because of landslides. after that, we went on to join Merlin's response team, and I think, as John said, we were heavily reliant on institutional funding from donors like ECHO or DFID and OFDA, where you might only get 7% of overheads, which meant that you were quite restricted. We did manage to secure some private funding for assessments and emergency startups, but as an agency dependent on this type of institutional funding, we were forced to coordinate more effectively. And so in many ways we were forced to participate much more strongly with the health cluster, which was looking at identifying gaps and looking at coverage and services. And so we did that a lot to avoid duplicating activities. However, as a relatively smaller agency compared to some, decision making was relatively fast, and as there were fewer people in the decision making process, and that made us relatively nimble. But our size often led us to explore partnerships, which meant we could cover more areas, both geographically or sectorially, and also allowed us to engage more widely. So, building a little bit more on what John was saying about Cyclone Nargis, when the cyclone hit Myanmar, our experience and role in the health cluster, as well as some work that we'd done in the previous year in Cyclone Cedar, where on behalf of the health cluster we did a health needs assessment of the entire affected area with a local partner, put us in a good position to work with partners to develop a multi-sector assessment across all affected areas. This increased access to areas in Myanmar that were very restrictive. It was a government that was quite tight. In fact, when I actually did get down to the Delta, it was going without permission, and basically we didn't lie, but our driver told them we'd forgotten to get our permission, but we managed to get in, partly because I think the services were so overwhelmed. But there were still a lot of areas during that response that agencies just couldn't access. So this assessment that was developed later became the PONREP, and this also led us to work more widely and look at emergencies and how assessments were conducted then. And so with HelpAge and NRC, we worked to establish ACAPS, the Assessment Capacities Project based in Geneva, which is still working today, looking at needs assessments in emergency. And as John said, we already had a presence in Myanmar, so when other agencies did not, which led to our partnership with Mercy Corps and Oxfam. And by working together, we were able to illustrate to provide a multi-sector response across the Puta district, which covered health, wash, nutrition, cash for work, shelter, food security, and delivering NFIs. And at a national level, we were able to second technical staff into WHO, as well as working with the health cluster. However, while our profile has occasionally was rising internationally and within the sector, we were little known within the UK, except for our odd emergency response, such as Haiti, where we set up a field hospital. And I think I want to finish there, but just say I think it's really been appreciated by those that were at Merlin that John took on the huge challenge of documenting our history. It's something we struggled to do, and at times we did it better when we had a policy team, but as John said, that was relatively short-lived. So.
Thanks.
So now we turn to Jenny Chapman, who is a PhD student in HCRI, has the good fortune to be supervised, at least in part by me, also by John, and by Bertrand up the back there. So Jenny completed her Masters with HCRI in 2015, so she's in her second year of her PhD, which is based in HCRI, as I mentioned, but also involves collaboration with the Humanitarian Affairs team at Save the Children UK. We have not yet joined forces with Save the Children, although perhaps that will be part of our future. Her research looks at the British humanitarian sector with a particular focus on medical aid between the period of 1988 and 2014. And she's tracing changes and developments that have taken place within the sector during this period, which is the focus of her contribution today.
Hello. I firstly want to thank you both for your presentations. As Ellen has just said, I'm in my second year, and I'm looking at the British humanitarian medicine during the period of 1988 to 2014. And I think that kind of sentence alone shows how valuable John's work will be, for me at least, within my project. So I was asked to come here today to talk about the broader context of medical humanitarian aid, for which the Merlin story has played out. The period in which Merlin worked between 1993 to 2013 was a period of great change within the British humanitarian system, and therefore had a big effect on British medical response. So to look at this change, I thought I'd break it down kind of to make 3 points today, quite briefly, don't worry. So firstly, just to recognise that there was a big change that went on within British humanitarianism during this period. Secondly, how organisations like Merlin had to adapt to these changes. And thirdly, the unique position that Merlin held within this sector. And just to kind of cover my own back, I'm aware I'll be making some quite broad generalisations, so bear with me. Merlin was created at kind of a period at the end of the Cold War, and it was a period of great optimism, I think, within the British humanitarian sector. It was also came after a period of a huge boom in humanitarian organisations. So, as a bit of data here, between 1980 and 1990, the number of northern NGOs doubled from 1,600 to more than 2,500, which I think is quite a huge increase in 10 years. As John has explained, this period saw the creation of DFID, or the Department for International Development, in the 1990s. And with this came a renewed pressure for humanitarian organisations to develop sustainable long-term goals. And the effect on, therefore, humanitarian medical response was that a lot of the medical interventions were required to have long-term impacts, and this saw the expansion of the use of wide-scale health campaigns. During this period, we also saw the development of an increasingly professionalised humanitarianism. And this can be seen in the creation of the Sphere Standards in 1997. And for medical organisations, this created the pressure to provide proper training for its medical teams, an increased focus on accountability of medical professionals within these austere environments, and also the really development of things technically, such as the emergency health kit that practitioners would come and take out with them during responses. Finally, as well, during the start of the 21st century, I guess, there was an ever-increasing recognition of the complexity of emergencies, as the definition of a humanitarian space became ever more blurred. And with this, medical organisations found it increasingly challenging to access certain communities, but also saw the change in views towards hospitals becoming legitimate targets of war. Whilst I recognise no two humanitarian organisations are the same, the study of Merlin throughout this period has offered a crucial snapshot for one organisation's attempts to remain viable and at the forefront of this ever-changing environment. In many cases, the changes and adaptations Merlin made weren't unique. For example, within Save the Children, they also tried to promote this long-term impact of their programme. So you can see in their kind of 1989 report, them really pushing the fact that they had an extended and long-term work within the pools, really trying to publicise that. Also, if we see in the history of Merlin, you can notice it trying to rebrand itself and recreate a new public image throughout this period. And you can see that again in organisations such as the American organisation CARE, who changed its outlook to be a rights-based agency in an attempt to set itself apart in this kind of increasingly growing sector. But I think John's work doesn't just show Merlin to be one of many organisations dealing with change. Merlin, I think, in many ways is really unique, and I think most noticeably, as we've heard today, it's its commitment to that single mandate and its commitment to working with medicine. And I think this offered Merlin unique opportunities, but again brought with it unique challenges. So Merlin's focus on medicine enabled it to develop special skills within the field, and this recognition for these skills can be seen, as we've heard, in its lead role in the health cluster within the 2004 Myanmar response. Similarly, I think the single focus that Merlin gave to medicine gave it a space in which it could develop its research and create collaborative links between practitioners and academics. So throughout Merlin's time, it created a strong link with the School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine in London. And I think it's that kind of collaboration that HCRI, perhaps in a broader sense, attempts to replicate. So the focus on medicine, however, did not come without its own challenges, as we've seen financially. But I also see challenges in Merlin within this complex arena of relationships and power dynamics. Merlin had to work alongside the World Health Organization, who took organisational lead in many of their medical responses. It had to work within national health systems in the countries in which it delivered aid. And then also it had to work alongside the British government, who holds a lot of power over our own British healthcare system. So before handing back to Eleanor, and I guess drawing on that theme of relationships between state and the British healthcare system, I wanted to ask you a question, if that's okay. And I wanted to ask something that I think will help in my own research, but I think it's relevant today as well. I want to ask, to what extent did Merlin work and utilise the NHS, and what were the challenges that came with that?
Just for the discussion. Yeah. Okay, so we have one question on the board already. I'll take them in, say, 2s or 3s, depending how long they are, and then please feel free to direct your question to all of the speakers or to one particular speaker this evening. So I saw, did I see a hand from Pesh? Yes, so please go ahead.
Oh, questions and comments. I think you stopped, John, at an intriguing moment. And I guess we have to wait for, as you coyly put it, the commercially available monograph to find out the story. I mean, if I may comment and ask, I don't know if you got hold of the internal secret archives of DFID or not.
No.
Oh, pity. You should ask me, because I've got a box this full in my garage, if you like to see.
Is that okay under the Official Secrets Act?
Well, I mean, the thing is, I won't tell him how you got it.
You didn't hear
that. I want to make 2 comments.
Yeah.
There is, actually, what you've done is a very good history, but there is also a secret history of Merlin, which is not evident in what you say. The first thing is, there was a backdrop. And I remember, because I was the head of the Humanitarian Department in DFID and bankrolled Merlin in program after program after program. And I went to monitor their work in Goma, in Rwanda, in Afghanistan, in Sierra Leone also. They were involved in DDR program to see how they operate on the ground. And were very, very good. But a couple of things why I think they finally lost favor with the powers, including myself. One is there was no intellectual content in Merlin's work, I felt. So when we were sitting in DFID, we were looking for influence on the world stage, not just logisticians and running clinics and so on. Important that I'm putting it a bit harshly, but I think the point was that there's a whole evolution going on at that moment in time. There's an intellectual evolution going on. And whereas MSF were actually innovating in thinking, Merlin were being highly effective in delivery, but there was no intellectual mass in the senior management team, number one. Number 2, inside DFID, as we moved from short-term to long-term programs, and I'm the one who wrote the new humanitarianism speech, which was highly controversial. And people like Save the Children opposed it, and Oxfam opposed it, and everyone opposed it, but we dragooned the policy through the white paper. But basically, fundamentally what happened was that there was a movement of power from my department, which was the emergency department, to the long-term department, which was the Africa department, which covered the long-term DRC programs. And anyone who's a friend of the emergency department, which is basically my department, dealing with rapid response emergencies, was automatically out of favor with the long-term bureaus. So what I think you underestimate is the importance of petty jealousies, personalities, including Chris Bess, who was a swashbuckling adventurer. And quite frankly, his style of working ran out of favor. And when I sat with him, when he announced, he came to my office and said, I'm leaving Merlin, and I said, why are you leaving Merlin in 1998? I got the impression that he was just bored, that he didn't want to do the log frames and the accountability and all those particular systems. And I demonstrated with him. I said, you can't leave Merlin now. And finally, my final comment is that we forced Merlin to take on roles, and this shows really, if you're doing your analysis, by the real secret relationship between the funder and NGOs. We were pissed off at MSF on a grand scale, we, the British government at the time. Why? Because MSF would not kowtow to the UK government, which was increasingly assertive because the aid budget was going on. And I remember asking them to go to Northern Iraq, and they said, you're bombing the Kurds, we're not going to work with you. And then, so what we did was, we had to say, we had to create our own MSF that would be compliant to the British interest. Now, of course, being out of government, I can say this is a ruthlessly instrumentalizing policy and completely against humanitarian principles. But when you're in government, your sole perspective is to implement the government policy, which you are writing yourself anyway. So I would say that there is a sub-track of history there, which explains the rise of Merlin. It was instrument for political objectives, and then why it fell into favor, partly as a consequence of its own inability to ride the political wave, and partly because actually it had nothing to offer after a time. Because then the competition had grown, there was much more other intellectual ideas. I struggled greatly to get Merlin admitted to the Global Health Cluster, because I was actually the chair of the Global Health Cluster in Geneva at that moment in time. So there's all that to go on, not to undervalue the work of Merlin people, don't get me wrong, but actually there is a real complex politics and a nasty politics, which also explains the rise and fall of Merlin.
Okay.
I wish I'd recorded that. Thank you very much.
Okay, Bertrand.
Thank you, Mukesh, for this diplomatic comment. I'm actually puzzled by. I'm turning to Mukesh because I'm so everybody's jaw is still on the floor. But one thing that I find astonishing in what you just said, Mukesh, that on the one hand, people were reproaching the lack of intellectual dynamism to an organization that they had themselves tried to construct as an instrument. So you create an instrument, and then you think the instrument is a bit dumb. Yeah. And then you withdraw your favor. So it's an extraordinary window into politics. But I was actually my real question wasn't really to Mukesh, it was actually to you, and it's about do you think there was actually an underinvestment in actually the mastery of those financial tools, and that in a sense, what's missing in the Merlin leadership policy at the onset is a fine appreciation of the bureaucratic needs of the humanitarian sector. And I mean, Jenny talked about professionalization, but actually, is it bureaucratization that we're talking about? And what could I mean? It's easy with hindsight to actually say, well, they didn't have those tools, but what were the signals that those tools were going to be so important at the beginning of the Merlin story? What were the missed signals?
Wow. Fantastic set of questions, and thank you very much, Mukesh. I really do wish I'd recorded that, because that's so valuable. I'll have to interview you again, clearly.
Provided you promise to reopen the book to finish the last chapter, or something.
Yeah, just if
we'll talk about it.
But if I can just digress a bit, the report has been seen by a very small number of people. There's a lot of sensitivity from Save the Children's side over Save the Children's image in how Save the Children comes out of this. And it comes out fine. I mean, from my perspective, there's nothing for them to worry about. There's perhaps some egos that involved in Merlin's history that may feel a bit dented, but I've tried to be as fair as to be fair. So what I'm wanting to do, but waiting for the requisite people in Save the Children to reassemble after playing rugby for Brazil in the Olympics. That when Giuliano's back, that rather than take it straight to publication, I want to circulate it, share it with a larger group, and to get feedback from a larger group, because I don't feel confident that I've got the whole story right. And I'd rather have a more iterative process where we open it up to a larger group and we get inputs like Mukesh uncovering his secret boxes and so on, that will enrich the story further and result in a more robust analysis of Merlin and a better locating of it in the wider context. I think a commercial publisher would be more interested in that than in the report as it currently stands, which is a bit, well, it's about Merlin. It's Merlin's history. It's not really lifting it out and putting it in the power dynamics and the context of change at the time.
We're going to run out of time, so we have, well, you may want to comment on the personalities sort of issue,
okay, yeah.
Bureaucratisation and the NHS.
Yeah. Just with the NHS, I'll start with that, Jenny. Yes, I think in Chris Bess's mind, he would have loved, and he did try, to develop links with the NHS. There was an encouragement of the head of the NHS, was it Neil Asherson, or I forget. Sir Donald. Sir Donald.
He was Chief Medical Officer.
Chief Medical Officer. There were links developed, conversations that went on, meetings were held, but they didn't go anywhere. The precise reasons why not, I think the prize that they were after was that somehow Merlin was going to become the sort of overseas deployment arm of the NHS. That was the dream, but it was never achieved.
I tell you what, DFID was determined that it would maintain control of overseas work, that wasn't going to let any home department, right, whether it was a Department of Health or any other department, to get into it. That's why we had numerous discussions with the Department of Health on many things. They wanted to interfere, and our response was, we do overseas, you do the UK, you've got enough to do here.
Okay, fascinating. But it didn't happen. It was a dream, but it didn't happen.